Welcome to MexMoves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. Good morning, Eduardo. How are you?
Do well, Damian. How are you?
Today we're going to interview later in the program Juan Carlos Zuazua. He's the CEO of Viva Aerobus, one of Mexico's two low-cost airlines. I think, Eduardo, we might look at the banking convention, which happened over the end of last week. Nubank results, Mercado Libre results. Anything from your side?
Well, I just saw that the Alsea also that we talked about in the past with the Chipotle brand, they got 100% control of their Starbucks operation in Colombia, which means the company continues to have the trust of the international division of the coffee house. It proves that its strategy, it seems to be working in South America.
Good. So shall we start with the bankers convention? As you saw, Emilio Romano, the head of Bank of America here in Mexico, was named the new president of the ABM. I think he's the first ever foreign bank investment banking or wholesale banking executive to lead the ABM. Hitherto, it's been big retail banks or Mexican investment wholesale banks. Bank of America has no branches in the United States, and that itself is interesting. Maybe ABM is trying to carry favor with the US, putting a big kind of iconic American bank head as their spokesperson. What's your take?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that he was appointed. Generally, in the past, the Banking Association, this is way back, was very nationalistic in that sense. I think that's changed over the past few years. I think the head of HSBC was the head of the Banking Association at some point. So, but now we have an investment banker who comes from a U.S. bank heading it. So it shows the dynamics of the sector, I would suspect.
That's right. I mean, in the back in the 90s, in 93, 94, Roberto Hernandez, who was the major shareholder, along with Alfredo Hupp of Banamex, was the head of the ABM. So you've gone from an association that used to be run by sort of billionaire Mexican owners of retail banks to, basically executives, in this case, of a foreign bank. So it's changed very much, which, as you say, partly reflects the makeup of the organization. Also, they go alternating from different groups. So it was the Bank of America's group's turn, in part. In the conference itself, well, it was held in Vallarta, in a very fancy hotel, the Vedanta Resort in Nueva Vallarta. I was told that some rooms at least were going for $1,000 a night. It's a very spacious resort, which complicated logistics for some, and it's a far cry from the Princess in Acapulco, where it used to be, and which was much kind of lower level type hotel. You saw the normal subjects being discussed. The importance of increasing credit penetration. The president, in her speech, talks about how banks need to give out more credit. Although the ultimate agreement to increase lending to pymes, to small Mexican businesses, by 3.5% a year seemed a bit underwhelming. It's barely above GDP, may even be in line with forecast GDP. It wasn't a big headline grabbing number. There was quite a lot of talk, both in the speeches and then perhaps more in the sidelines, about anti-money laundering, know your customer, financial crime. The banks are quite concerned about the designation of certain Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations, because if they unwittingly host these cartels or members of these cartels as clients or transfer money on their behalf, they could be aiding and abetting terrorist organizations, which opens them up to criminal sanctions. So there was quite a lot of talk about that. There was also a lot of talk about further digitalization of the financial sector and reducing Mexico's heavy preponderance of cash.
Yes.
The new finance minister, Edgar Amador, mentioned that in his speech. But again, a little bit, lots of kind of lofty goals, and which no one can really disagree with, but perhaps a little bit short on specifics, like what is the government actually going to do to reduce cash usage? There are things it could do. It could make social programs paid in urban areas, at least through cards without cash out, so people would be forced to use cards in mom and pop establishments, and that would help tax collection as well. so far at least, maybe there'll be more to come. There hasn't been any announcements. The central bank did talk about creating a kind of digital lending platform that banks would join and customers could look at, different credit options and presumably pick the cheapest or the best, with everyone uploading their deals to this platform. Now, the central bank has, compared to Brazil and many other countries, India, of course, has been pretty disappointing in its management of digitalization through CODI and DEMO, which are far, far short of those other countries. So I have my doubts that this new digital platform will really take off, because the banks, especially the big banks that dominate the market, will probably, based on what happened with Demo and Collie, will play a sort of passive-aggressive game, sort of saying out loud, of course, this is brilliant, we're fully supportive, but actually not making it very functional and not using it. So without a heavy hand, which the Brazilian central bank has had in pushing PIX, some of these initiatives may fall short. Hopefully I'm wrong. You also saw, Eduardo, the much greater presence, of course, of the fintech, some of which have become banks in the last few years, such as Capital with a K, Covalto, Wala, of course, Bancacool, and then some of the other fintechs that have got their banking license, even though they're not actually operating as a bank. They still don't have the operating approvals in place. Like Nu has obviously got its license, Revolut's got its license, Plata have got its license, although they're all waiting to be operating and to be active. So that will shake things up a bit, I suspect.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting to me is, loan penetration has been growing steadily, but obviously it's insufficient. And I guess as long as the banks could still make a lot of money in non-interest ways, the incentive for them is less. So maybe there is some space on the regulatory framework to make them less profitable in the other sense. There's been talk about that all the time. Obviously, the banks push back on that. But, it's always the same, no? How many conventions have come and go, and they've always said we need to push credit for pymes, whatever. And it happens, but in a trickle way. My take is that banks make a lot of money otherwise. And why take the risk if you can make money with commissions and fees?
Well, one bank, or soon-to-be bank, that's shaking it all up is, of course, Nubank. They reported this week. Yeah. And as always with Nubank, with respect to their Mexico operations, there's good and bad news. And, depending on many cases, depending on your sort of previous point of view, you'll latch onto the good or the bad news. For the Nubank bulls, their customer base grew 70%. They now have 11 million customers in Mexico, which is a pretty impressive number. It's about 12% of the adult population. Their revenues doubled in Mexico to 240 million, and their deposit base continues to grow really well. It's at 5.4 billion in the quarter, which is a 20% jump on the fourth quarter last year. On the negative side, they are losing lots of money. They separately report their profit and loss for Mexico, not in their consolidated earnings, but their net interest margin in Mexico. Basically, the poor net interest margin figures weighed on the overall Nubank numbers. So much so that they actually reported Brazil net interest margins separately for the first time to tell people that actually Brazil's doing pretty well. It's Mexico that's hurting things at the consolidated level, and the stock was down after they reported the results. Partly because earnings were a little bit below consensus, and the net interest margin was a bit weak. And deposits are growing much faster than loans in Mexico. So at least in the very short term, the numbers are probably going to get worse, because they're paying 10 to 15%, depends what type of deal you get on their deposits, which is of course far more than our traditional banks pay. And although their loan rate on the credit card is much higher than that, they have these big write-offs and not non-performing loans, which eat into the margin there. So the company itself says that Mexico is still in an investment phase. They'll be bringing down the deposit rates as interest rates come down, and that net interest margin will improve. They'll become a bank. They'll cross-sell more products to their huge client base, and basically what they've been able to do in Brazil, they'll repeat here. And this, I think, starting this week, in a couple of days, new bank customers will be able to make cash in deposits in OXXO stores, which is a big deal, as OXXO obviously has nearly 25,000 stores in Mexico. They've already been able to make cash out transactions. So OXXO will effectively become the cash branch for Nu, but at a cost, which will further eat into Nu's margins, whereas if you go into and will cost the customer, whereas if you're a BBVA customer, you generally speaking, you don't pay any commission for cash out or cash in. So from a customer's point of view, there'll be a slight disadvantage banking with Nu if you use a lot of cash, and really, I think Nu only makes sense for customers that are fully digital.
Do you think that the digital or the fintechs will make the difference in the banking sector in the future, Damian?
Yeah, I think so. I think, over time, competition always brings margins down, and competition will bring down the spread between loans and deposits in Mexico. And Nu's got access to huge amounts of capital, which it's willing to spend on, and it's clearly got to make Mexico a success to prove that it's not just a one-trick sort of Brazil pony. So they will succeed. Mercado Pago, the fintech arm of Mercado Libre, I'm sure will succeed, and some of the other fintechs have interesting strategies. So, and then the incumbent banks will react and offer better yields on deposits to keep their deposits under control, and will step up on the credit card side. You haven't really seen a lot of competition from the fintechs on credit card rates. What they've done, they're still 100% plus. In fact, they're higher because they have a different type of customer than the rates on the credit cards from the traditional banks. So that will be the next kind of area of competition, when you see these very high rates on credit card loans coming down. Right now, they're focusing on bringing in customers that don't have a credit card or don't have a big enough credit card balance on their existing credit card, but not really focusing on bringing down rates for credit card customers.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see how it all evolves. Competition is always key for better service, lower prices, more products. So, I think not all the fintechs probably will survive, but there are a few that are well capitalized and have a business model that makes sense.
I mean, I think the key is for them to succeed, or for more of them to succeed, is for the overall economy to become more digital, because their big disadvantage is that Mexico is such a cash-driven economy. If you don't have branches, then...
That's surprising. Yeah, I wonder if it's cultural, but I don't think so.
I think it's tax. And cultural tax, we've talked about it before, it's a sort of mixture. But if the incentives are in place, people will change, like they changed in Brazil, like they changed in India. But the government has to put the incentives in place to digitalize financial transactions, and that would be good for tax collection, good for transparency in the economy, and indirectly good for fintechs, and would help bring down the spreads between deposits and loans and increase credit penetration. So it would have a lot of different effects, but it does require a lot of political leadership.
Without a doubt.
Also, Mercado Libre reported a few days before Nu, the investors often sort of compare these two sort of Latin American giants. Mercado Libre, this year has done a lot better than Nu. Mercado Libre, obviously, but not of its value is on the e-commerce side, although Mercado Pago is also a big part of it. Their results were good in Mexico, even though a bit of a slowdown compared to the very fast growth that Mercado Libre and Mercado Pago had last year. Their gross merchandise volume in Mexico was up 23%, I think, on a FX neutral basis. So it's still pretty impressive, even not quite as fast as you'd seen before. On the Mercado Pago side, you also saw 50% growth on an FX neutral basis. So their numbers continue to be good. They continue to clearly gain share. They're growing faster than the overall retail sector and probably faster than e-commerce in general, and they're profitable, even if the overall results and the strong sort of positive stock market reaction was probably driven more by good things going on in Argentina than Mexico per se.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story, the one that Mercado Libre. I mean, it's an old company for the fintech world, but it's grown and it's changed and it's evolved, and it's where it is right now, competing heavily with Amazon, or even having a greater market share in Mexico than these other tech giants. So we'll have to keep an eye on it for the future.
Also, Eduardo, on transportation, I wanted to give a little bit of background before we interview Juan Carlos from Viva Aerobus. We saw April numbers for the airports, for the airlines, for the listed train companies at least. April was a bit of an unusual month because we got Holy Week in April. It's obviously a big holiday here. And last year in 2024, Holy Week was in March, and there tends to be more travel in Holy Week. So it's not seasonally exactly comparable. But the OMA Airport Group had great numbers. Their main airport is obviously Monterrey, and they did much better than the other airport operators, GAP, which is mainly Guadalajara in the Pacific, and Azul, which is mainly Cancun and the Southeast. So OMA in April, their revenues were up by about 19%. And that was driven by Monterrey, where there's been sort of investment in the airport, and Monterrey was up 34%. So at least as of today, the Trump sort of tariff threat isn't changing air traffic, to the north of Mexico. GAP was up 9%, and Azul was only up 4%. And interestingly, Cancun, despite the Holy Week effect, was actually down. So some signs that Cancun is struggling a bit compared to the past, where it had shown obviously a lot of growth. I'm not sure what is holding back Cancun, but it might be interesting to look at that in the future.
And the airlines also, some of them did well. Viva Aerobus did very well. Its passenger traffic grew 14%, if I recall correctly. I think the one that didn't do that well was Aeromexico.
Yeah, so Aeromexico traffic was actually down, and Volaris was up about 15% in passengers, and Viva was up about 18%. Both Viva and Volaris were helped a little bit by some of the Pratt & Whitney engines that had been recalled on their A320s, been returned. So they saw an increase in the number of available seats, the number of planes, and so that has helped them sort of put capacity back to where it was a couple of years ago, even if, especially in the case of Volaris, the load usage went down. I mean, interesting to give some context before the Juan Carlos interview. Viva is still the third largest airline of three airlines, but it is catching up really fast on Volaris, despite having publicly at least raised a lot less equity than Volaris. It seems, from the outside at least, to have chosen its routes a bit better, or maybe just been lucky. And as far as you can see from the public data, its cost ex fuel are a bit lower than Volaris's. And I think it perhaps managed more nimbly the Pratt & Whitney engine recall issue by getting planes very fast, thanks to its alliance with Allegiant. So to give you some examples, Volaris in the first quarter carried 7.4 million passengers, and Viva about 6.8. So Volaris a little bit bigger, but back in 2019, pre-COVID, Volaris had more than double the passengers that Viva had. So, and now it's only about 10% more. So, the gap between the two has narrowed, even though back in December 2020, Volaris raised another $160 million at $11.25 stock price compared to about $4 today. Viva seems to have been, has been catching up quite a lot on Volaris, and of course, as we'll hear from Juan Carlos, has made more of a bet on the new and somewhat controversial airport in Mexico City, the AIFA airport, where it has many more routes than Volaris right now. Either because, as Juan Carlos says, it makes sense with the AICM airport, more or less saturated, or because they want to carry favor with the government, maybe a little bit of both, right?
Have you used the IFA, Damien, yourself?
I have actually quite a few times at this point. I like it from a passenger point of view. Mainly, I like it because the price is, in my experience, at least about half on the same route as going from AICM, especially to Monterrey. So that's great if you're paying your own ticket. And if you choose kind of off-peak times and you have your own car, you can get there, in an hour if you're lucky, if you're somewhat lucky, but especially if you're leaving very early in the morning, and then come back late at night, which isn't hugely different to getting to AICM. So, and then when you actually arrive at the at AIFA, you rarely get like a big waiting time because it's still operating far below capacity. Whereas often at AICM, you could be stuck in the plane for half an hour or so while they're trying to find a gate.
Correct. I've done it too, and I think I use the bus transportation to get in and out of the airport, and it's good. And now if the train finishes up from Buena Vista, where I live, is quite convenient. So as we will hear with Juan Carlos, that might be a game changer in the future if it actually opens up in July. It's been delayed for a few times, so hopefully this will be the last delay. Do you want to jump into the interview with Juan Carlos, or you to avoid talking about trade for the first time in many weeks?
Yeah, let's do that. So today we're super excited to be joined by Juan Carlos Zuazua, who's the CEO of Viva Aerobus, Mexico's fastest growing airline and a pioneer in ultra low cost carrier space. Since taking the helm, I think in 2010, just 29 years old, Juan Carlos has led Viva's transformation into one of the market leaders, serving 25 million passengers, over 80 Airbus aircraft, and a growing network that includes both Mexico and US routes over more than 50 destinations. And Juan Carlos has steered Viva through everything, really, from pandemic collapse in demand to the recent surge, and then some more recent issues that I'm sure he's going to talk about, perhaps related to the crackdown on immigration. And under his leadership, Viva Aerobus has not only democratized air travel in Mexico, but it's also been very efficient and financially successful. So Juan Carlos, it's a pleasure to have you on MexMoves. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Damian and Eduardo, for the invitation.
So you've captured, Viva Aerobus has captured a huge and growing share of Mexico's air travel market, despite starting later than your rivals, Volaris and Aeromexico, with respect to the domestic airlines. What's the secret to your success? Why have you done so well?
We started close to 18 years ago, and back then there were like 16 carriers in Mexico, 16. Most of them focused to a very small minority of people that could afford to fly, right? So what we did back then and today, we simply identified a big blue ocean of people that were either not traveling or traveling once every 3 or 4 years or traveling by bus, right? So we decided to implement and replicate a proven ULCC business model, right? Such as the likes of Ryanair in Europe, the Ryan family was our co-investors for about a decade, together with Yamsam Group, and simply we identified a way of operating this ULCC business model successfully in Mexico, right? And it's simply based on getting the best productivity and efficiency out of your assets. The most important asset, number one, is the planes, number two is the people, and apart from that, the rest is history. We've been able to grow sustainably. We've had a lot of bumps in the road with so many crises in these almost 2 decades. But luckily, the Mexican aviation market is still so underpenetrated. There's a huge opportunity to continue growing our business, both domestically and internationally, right? So we have the lowest cost per seat in the region, not only in Mexico, in the Americas. So at the end, in this industry, what we identified is the reason why people were not traveling and are not traveling today simply because they cannot afford it, right? So if you can price correctly and you can offer $50 average fares, that's our average fare last year, we were able to stimulate demand, put more bumps on the seats, and being able to grow, right? That's a history of Viva.
And how do you keep those costs down? I mean, everyone wants to be, the lowest cost operator probably in every business, but how are you able to achieve it to a better extent than your rivals?
I think one of that is taking the right aircraft decision. I mean, we decided back then to transition from the Boeing 737 Classic, a 148-seater, to the Airbus A220 family with 186 seats in the plane. Later down the road, we increased the size of the plane to the Airbus A321 with 240 seats. So we have a single type configuration with maximum seat density. We ensure that aircraft is flown with the maximum number of flights per day, right? So we have a very productive, efficient line, right? Put it that way, able to produce sufficient number of seats and spread the fixed cost among all these seats, right? Apart from that, we ensure we can finance these aircraft creatively, get to the right type of financiers in the world, in Asia, in Europe, in North America, to ensure we have the lowest cost of aircraft ownership, together with high aircraft productivity. That's like a very important part of the secret sauce. Of course, the staff is also very important, having a very productive staff aligned with how we operate the airline, having a great culture, and lastly, negotiating very good contracts with all type of vendors. I mean, all the way from maintenance, long-term contracts, either OEMs, all the way to systems, etc. Right. So at the end, this is not a simple strategy, but at the end, if you're consistently ensuring that every decision you make, it's aligned towards reducing the cost of operating every single seat. At the end, you can transfer these costs to the consumer, and you can stimulate demand. And in the other side, once you have the low costs, that's it's not the easy part. I mean, but at the end, once you have 6 sectors per day per aircraft flying, you need to ensure you're filling them, right? So, of course, flying with load factors, with high load factors is important. With average or competitive fares is also important, but you need to also bring, if you look at our financial information, which is public in our website, you're going to realize, I mean, last year we had a turnover around $2.5 billion, and 50% of that revenues are ancillary revenues. I mean, a part of the fares, we are creatively and we're trying to bring new source of revenues to the business. Some of those flight related and some others travel related, meaning what people and passengers can do on their destinations. So we're trying to tap new revenue sources in order to keep the average fare pressure down and continue stimulating demand, right? So that's pretty much how we do it, and we just need to make sure we continue this virtuous cycle and ensure we can continue tapping new sources of demand.
Juan Carlos, you sound like it's an easy business, but airlines have never been easy to run. Congratulations on what you've accomplished. And productivity and efficiency, that's what everybody wants. But to get there, I'm sure it requires what you just told us later on in your answer. But what makes you different from your main competitor, Volaris?
I think, Volaris and us, we have a similar type of business model. I mean, we might have some similarities in the way we operate our fleet, on the way we operate both operationally and commercially, right? I mean, at the end, the value proposition we have, ensure we could differentiate with a stronger brand, that we can, of course, we operate in different parts of Mexico. Volaris has a stronger presence in some parts. We have a stronger presence in some other parts. We compete in a lot of routes similar to Aeromexico, particularly in Mexico City area. At the end, in a highly competitive industry such as ours, I mean, number one, it's important to have an advantage on the cost side, right, which we do. So you're able to price competitively whenever you are competing in a given market with another airline. But also commercially, you need to be very creative, right, on how you run your revenue management, the type of technology and the strategy you have behind, and also how are you running your ancillary revenue strategy, right, on the new type of revenue streams you can be able to bring into the system to offer to your passengers, and the type of technology you can put in place to be able to improve the value proposition to your customers every time they're coming into the booking funnel. Once they book a seat, you follow them after the booking process till the day of departure, trying to offer them upsell opportunities and trying to improve the value proposition, number one, and of course the total revenue per passenger. And at the end, it's a combination of many small things. So a cost advantage and being much more creative on the revenue side.
Well, Carlos, one thing that I noticed when some of these crises that you mentioned before come it's that the airports are not as badly hit as the airlines are. Is there some unfair advantage that the airports have over you guys?
Yes, airports in Mexico, they have a significant competitive advantage in our view because they were granted a very onerous concession 25 years ago, and it's pretty much a money-making machine. So they are charging passenger service fees significantly above industry average in other parts of the world. So yes, I mean, it's a little bit unfair because, I mean, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, the average net profit margin for Mexican airports is like 43 or 44%. If you look at the Mexican airlines, it's like 3 or 4%. And very few of the airlines will make money. So yes, it's a little bit unfair, but that's the rules of the game in which we're operating, and still 25 more years of the concession pending on these 3 private airport groups, right? So it is what it is, right? That was many years ago, 1998, when those concessions were granted.
Juan Carlos, first quarter seemed to be a difficult quarter. Your operating revenues were down. Volaris also reported a tough quarter. Volaris' stock, I think, is down about 50% this year in a market that's up. What's going on? Is this because of the Trump crackdown, the Pratt & Whitney recall, which seemed to be more of an issue, at least for Volaris last year, or are other variables in the short term, at least, affecting the industry?
I think the Pratt & Whitney issue is an issue that will continue. I mean, it started last year, this year, and at least the next 2 years. That's a global crisis many airlines are facing with so many aircraft on the ground. I mean, Volaris, us, and other 50-plus airlines in the world. So that's an issue we're going to continue navigating throughout this crisis. I believe last year, 2024 was a record year in profits for the airline industry in Mexico for several reasons. One of those, the exchange rate last year was 17 pesos, given that in our case, we sell most of our revenues in pesos. So we had we're a functional reporting currency in the US. And quarter over quarter, there was like a 20% FX variation, right? That impacted our unit revenues. Demand is still holding there. I mean, I'm still optimistic on demand. Of course, there's, potentially some volatility with this geopolitical uncertainty on the immigration side, but I wouldn't be that concerned. I mean, let's not forget that Mexico to the U.S. international market, that's the biggest international air market in the world. 40 million passengers travel a year, right? Half of that is tourism coming from the U.S. to the Mexican beaches. So yes, I mean, there's a softness in the demand, certainly, compared to last year, given that last year, the first quarter was a record year. Remember last year what happened? There was a big reduction on the capacity side, on the supply side, given to the Pratt & Whitney issues, etc. So fares increased significantly. But if you compare it to 2023, it's pretty much a normal, seasonally weak Q1. In Mexico, aviation Q1 is a very seasonally weak quarter. So, but if you look at the load factors, they're still holding up. So I wouldn't be that concerned.
And what about the Trump issue? I mean, at least Volaris in their conference call talked about people being more reluctant to fly to the United States because of concerns about immigration checks or family members telling them to stay away. Have you seen that as an issue, or is that just hearsay?
Honestly, we have not seen that as a big issue. Of course, that there might be potentially some reduction on migration travel. But look, any person that flies between Mexico and the U.S. is because they have all the papers in order, right? I mean, there's not illegal migration traveling through the air, right? Unfortunately. I mean, I believe with so much uncertainty, people might be holding up decisions for non-essential travel, and that might be the case. But I'm optimistic that we're going to sort out this crisis as many others, right? So hopefully we can navigate it.
Juan Carlos, you use the AIFA terminal from Mexico City. Do you expect, with the completion of the train from Buena Vista to that airport, that the number of flights that you offer clients in Mexico will increase? Or what can you tell us about that terminal?
Yeah, we operate on the 3 Mexico City airports. The original, which is AICM, Benito Juárez. We also operate in Toluca, and since day one on the new Mexico City airport, which is AIFA, we operate there. We have now launched over 39 or 40 routes, close to 40 routes. Our size of our business right now in the new Mexico City airport is greater now than Benito Juárez. We have like 54 daily departures out of out of IFA. And we're very excited on this new airport. What's the future of this terminal, Eduardo? I think the phase one of this airport with the terminal that is currently in operation has a maximum capacity of 20 million people, 20 million passengers per year, which is half of the old Mexico City airport with the existing infrastructure and two terminals. So I think they are going well ahead of their plans. Right now, the passengers forecasted for this year like 5 million people, 5 million passengers. So that's very good for a new airport. I see that continue growing, not only us, and hopefully very soon more international airlines are going to start flying there, given the operational efficiency you have with a much younger and newer in all fronts. I mean, the airport, right? I mean, remember that the previous airport was built in 1952, right? So still very old. It was not designed to meet the capacity and the size of the planes that are flying in today's aviation. A big detonator, of course, is going to be the new train that Buenavista in July most likely is going to start operation from Buenavista to IFA, 40-minute ride. That's going to be a game changer in our view in a multi-airport system, as you might see in other regions in the world, like London, in which you can jump in Liverpool station and you can go either to Stansted or to Heathrow or etc. I mean, it's very common that people start jumping in trains and head to the airport instead of driving, right? So that's going to be something important for this important project. But overall, I think Mexico, being one of the most populated areas in Latin America, needed an additional airport capacity. So I believe this project is working well, and we're excited on the future, right? I mean, and Viva is growing on this new airport, and we're happy with the outcomes. I mean, high load factors and overall good results.
And where do you see growth more on your side, domestically, internationally? Any preference on any of the two?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're like 25% of our traffic is international. I mean, we're still very bullish on the domestic side, given that Mexico is still has one of the lowest per capita trips in Latin America, right? So there's still huge room to grow, particularly in new airports around Mexico. I mean, there are some areas in Mexico that potentially are getting a little bit more congested in air traffic, but there are certainly many airports in region, meaning like regional aviation, where we believe there's a big room to start new bases and connect point-to-point traffic. Different from other regions, I mean, if you go back in Mexico 10, 15, or 20 years ago, if you didn't live in Mexico City, most likely you needed to take 2 flights to connect any 2 dots within Mexico domestic, right? So that's what Viva is changing right now. You can fly nonstop from many destinations without going through Mexico City. Yeah, I mean, I think domestic opportunities are still there, and certainly international opportunities, mainly to the north, are also optimistic. And hopefully, very soon, all these geopolitical issues will be settling down. Hopefully, new deals are going to come into the table between the U.S. and countries like Mexico, which is a big trading partner. So I'm optimistic on the future.
Any chances of going public?
We have some public debt, but I mean, clearly market volatility and uncertainty is not the right time. We tried to IPO, I believe, 2014, over a decade ago, and if you look at our growth plan, we have not only delivered a growth plan, but exceeded. We have a good balance sheet, very low net leverage. So I mean, there's not an imminent need of bringing new funding. But look, I mean, we'll explore new opportunities and alternatives in the future. So far, we have successfully been able to finance our fleet acquisitions, right, with different alternatives. And fortunately, there's a lot of available money, international money mainly, to fund our growth, right? So we're happy on that side.
How integrated are you, Juan Carlos, with Grupo Yamsa, with the ETN and the other bus companies, part of the transportation conglomerate? Are you very standalone, or is it a fairly integrated transportation operation?
We are independent companies. Of course, we are majority owned by Grupo Yamsa, but commercially we are very well integrated, meaning that we sell tickets in all of their bus stations. So if you arrive over 400 bus stations in Mexico, we're the only airline that can do that. So if you arrive to, let's say, I don't know, in the northeast part of Mexico to Nuevo Laredo, to a bus terminal, you can buy a complete journey from Nuevo Laredo to Cancun. So from Nuevo Laredo to Monterrey, you're going to go in Omnibus de Mexico with a 50% discount. And then you get to the airport, to the bus terminal in Monterrey, and then there's a shuttle that's going to take you to the airport in Monterrey, and then a flight from Monterrey to Cancun. And you can do that in a single transaction, right? So these multimodal services is an important part of our business. Around 20% of our daily passengers are taking a bus before or after their flight. 20%, that's huge. So people are benefiting from the YAMSA feeder network, right? Because they offer a 50% discount. So passengers take a flight, and most likely, if they, let's say, I'm in Monterrey, and many passengers that fly to Monterrey, they are going to the border in Tamaulipas or to Saltillo or to Torreon, and they take this one of these bus lines to travel 200 kilometers, right? So that's the beauty of the density of a big bus network in Mexico. That's how we could cooperate and coexist very nicely.
And presumably it's helped you kind of know your customers and treat them in the way they want to be treated. I mean, there's also a cultural element, because getting on a Viva Aerobus plane is very different to getting on a United or Aeromexico plane.
Totally. At the end, our type of customers, and that's the reason why YAMSA invested in Viva 18 years ago, because they knew that the middle class customers eventually was going to be trading from the bus to the air, right? As it happened in many other regions. I mean, from the Greyhound to the Southwest in the US and in Europe, etc. So at the end, this in many mid to long sector routes, we have been able to successfully migrate this bus customer to the air. We still share a lot of customers, because a lot of customers are still traveling in bus in short sectors. I mean, if you want to go to San Miguel de Allende from the center of Mexico, there's not a flight there. I mean, you're going to take an ETN from Mexico City or from Querétaro or from Bajío to go to San Miguel, right? And that customer will fly with us. And that's the reason why our loyalty program, which is Doctors, now close to 10 million members, it's also a loyalty program of this bus company. So when you ride with ETN, you accumulate points that then you can redeem to a flight to Cancun and vice versa. Right, so many of these bus companies, Grupo Flecha Amarilla, Primera Plus, etc., have joined this coalition loyalty program because passengers are jumping from the bus to the air and vice versa.
Is it true to say that Grupo YAMSA's, from the point of view of trips per customer, is one of the largest in the world outside China and India?
Yeah, I mean, Mexico's bus industry is 2.5 billion bus journeys domestic. It's top 3 in the world. I mean, the aviation is only 120 million air journeys a year. So YAMSA moves around 220 million passengers a year. So it's a big bus conglomerate. I mean, highly fractioned because they operate in like 26, 27 states in Mexico. But look, I mean, it's an important industry. We only have 2 public forms of transportation, the airline and the buses. We don't have fast trains still. Hopefully soon we're going to see new train projects with this new administration. But it's a very important form of transportation still.
Would you say that and that the fact that your fleet is one type of airline of jet are crucial for Viva Aerobus success?
I mean, that's very important. For the cost side, having single fleet type commonality creates a lot of simplicity for your crews, for your line techs, for your training, for everything, right? I mean, that's an important part of the operation.
Final question, Juan Carlos, the World Cup. Are you and is the airline industry prepared for this influx of people from around the world and then moving around Mexico, moving to US and Canada?
We're very excited. We are the official sponsor of the Mexico football team, La Selección. And we're excited because this is going to be an important tournament, which is going to be the first World Cup of a bigger format. So it's going to be lasting more than a month. And we believe there's going to be a lot of tourism, not only for the Mexico matches in the 3 cities, but also a lot of Mexicans traveling to the US and a lot of international people entering to Mexico and then going to the US or Canada or vice versa, right? So we're preparing, right? I mean, we're excited on this important tournament, and it's going to be great for the country.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Juan Carlos, for agreeing to speak to us at MexMoves.
Thank you, Damian and Eduardo. Very nice having you.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Very interesting.
We're very happy to have with us today Alex González Ormerod. Alex is an author, journalist, historian. He has a great Substack, which I strongly recommend, The Mexico Political Economist, that looks at Mexico policy, politics, economics, and history, and the intersection between all of that. Alex is with us today to talk about Plan Mexico, Sheinbaum's new industrial policy for Mexico. Thank you, Alex, very much for joining.
Hey there, Damian. Thank you for having me on.
So, Alex, why don't we start at the beginning? Plan Mexico is ambitious. It's also sprawling everywhere, a bit difficult to make out what it exactly means for the Mexican economy. What's your take? Is this a credible industrial policy that's going to make Mexico better off, or mostly a branding exercise that wraps old programs in new packaging?
The answer is a bit of both. The piece we recently wrote for the Mexico Political Economist, we sort of break down the different sectors that the Sheinbaum administration is trying to tackle. And basically, overall, it's very early days. So what we've tried to look for is, are we going in the right direction? And the answer is, again, right, both. You've got lots of cases, especially when it comes to infrastructure, very basic infrastructure, if we're honest, where we are definitely moving in the right direction. There are the right incentives. And then the more ambitious you get, I feel the government is more half-hearted about its policies, and it becomes more, we'll call it aspirational. And I personally like them to go a bit further because it becomes a bit sort of like propagandy towards the more ambitious side of the plan.
So which parts of it do you like and which parts of it do you not like?
I like the incentives that are being started to be laid out for industry, I think. One of the things that is undeniable about the Mexican state right now is that there is no money. There's very little money for ambitious big things, and yet big ambitious things do need to happen. And I think very clearly the Mexican state has realized that it needs the private sector to do that. And so you see it through little hints like the fact that pension funds, for example, are being incentivized to invest in things like industrial parks, for example, with a few sort of tweaks in the regulatory system. The fact that both Pemex and CFE, that's the national oil company, and the electricity company, both state not only owned but run. Sure, they've undergone this big reform that gives them a lot of power to the state, and yet we've recently had a little recent reform saying, oops, actually, we'd rather have a lot more private investment, which they were previously sort of reticent towards. And so, and all the basic things like water, like roads, like ports, like trains, electricity and energy generally, I think the direction of the incentives, as I said, is going in the right direction. When it comes to what Mexico does well, I've divided it up into three things, sort of the fundamentals, the reasonable sort of approach things, and the very ambitious projects. When it comes to the reasonable approach things, I think they're decidedly unambitious, probably because there is no money, right? They're just basically applauding investment. They're clearly far more open to companies than the previous administration was. And I think, to be honest, that's excited private industry in a weird and wonderful way. Also, the fact that Trump is so aggressive against what is basically an export economy makes it so that the Sheinbaum government's support has become a basic necessity for business. So there's a sort of sense of goodwill that works together, both for the Plan Mexico, for its branding, look, business is with us, but also for business. They feel that the government's got their back.
Alex, sounds very interesting with your analysis on it. So are we looking at a government that is doing what probably some of us thought the government should have done when neoliberalism was in place, in the sense of being the oversighter, the regulator, the incentivizer for private companies to do what they do best, while the government stays as the referee, shall we call it?
I'd go a bit further. I think the big failure of what people have now started calling neoliberalism was leaving the state at the sort of referee role. Even in sort of like, properly right-wing conferences like the Milken conference that just happened in LA. These aren't like your socialists. This is like the IMF. This is the Economist. These are like center-right people. And the thing in everyone's mouth is industrial policy. I think we're back to the age of industrial policy now that we've seen what China can do, what the US can do with all the sort of investments that we've seen. I think it's about intelligent investment, and it's about competition. The big failures, especially in Mexico in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that took us towards privatization and neoliberalism, were in large part wrought because of the fact that the state controlled everything. That's a mistake. I think this more hybrid approach where the state is involved and is competitive, for example, we'll see how it goes, right? It might be a return failure, but the telecoms system in Mexico is one of sort of the dark patches of the Mexican economy. It's overly expensive. It's sort of weirdly regulated. So the government's rushing in with like its own telecoms company to compete with the private sector. It's a sort of muddled up system. So I wonder if it'll work out. But I think in principle, it's sort of nice to see the government competing fairly, I'd say, hopefully, in sectors where there does need to be more competition. Mexico, after all, is a country of monopolies and duopolies. And so there does need to be more competition to let sort of like the capitalist system of the country thrive.
Now, in the case of telecom, there is concern about giving the state too much leeway on having free spectrum and free conditions that will give them an edge over private sectors. This morning, casually, the Mañanera was trying to dismiss that theory by pointing out that it would only be on social needs for interconnection. But what's your take on that? Is it something that we should be worried?
You've fallen in my trap, Eduardo. I mentioned it because I was also looking at the Mañanera, and basically, to me, that's the biggest pitfall because we've seen it in energy, we've seen it in telecoms. It's government overreach in places where they might have an unfair advantage over their competitors. I don't think that's sort of like, I'm not philosophically against it, but in a state that doesn't have enough money, I don't think it's a correct use of the capital. So if the state were able to provide cheap and affordable and effective telecoms, that would be fine. And yet, I don't think that's that's money well spent, especially in the electricity company, which I've always thought to be an interesting place to put that responsibility. We've got a wonderful, I think this is a weird and wonderful era of responsibilities that probably shouldn't be going to certain departments, going to them, especially the Digital Transformation Agency, which seems to be Claudia Sheinbaum's everything agency. They have national security things. They're designing the Mexican space program. They've got their fingers in every single pie.
Alex, we have a couple of examples in the previous administration of the state getting heavily involved in infrastructure projects. Dos Bocas, which probably cost near $20 billion and is still operating, as far as we know, far below capacity and probably losing money. And we have the Tren Maya that may have cost sort of $5 to $10 billion, and very few people are using it, it seems. Why should we be optimistic that this time around it's going to be any different? Shouldn't the state spend its limited resources on education, on health, and on basic infrastructure, and leave the private sector to be responsible for the rest?
It depends on the program, right? I think Dos Bocas is a bit of an environmental disaster. Now, this is sort of a play on geopolitics. This is very much based on the obsession with sovereignty that the government has. And instead of saying how much money they're losing or how under the amount of fuel they should be producing at this point, the government will instead point you towards Europe during the Ukraine war and how threatened they were by Russian gas lines being cut off, and then we'll point you over to Donald Trump and saying it's not about efficiency, it's about security. So I think that's a debate I'm not entirely convinced by, but that's what the argument they're making. But I think the other side of things is also it's very early days. I've seen so many projects, not necessarily even this particular government, that do take a bit of time to take off. I remember the Tren Suburbano that connects the state of Mexico to Mexico City proper. And for about a couple of years, it was empty and it was declared an enormous failure. And now it's one of the most overcrowded pieces of infrastructure, an essential infrastructure. Society does need to recalibrate. When it comes to the Tren Maya, I'm actually more interested in the cargo side of it, which they're starting to really get around to. One of my arguments has been that a big part of this trains focus from the Claudia Sheinbaum administration, lots of the infrastructure money is going towards trains. The sort of PR side is we're bringing back, like passenger trains because that's what most voters will recognize. No one really cares about the sort of efficiencies of cargo on the road versus the rail. But actually, I think the rail expansion on cargo trains will be far more important, economically speaking, and in the long term. But that will take a lot longer, and you can see that sort of moving along. So I think one of them is time. It's early days still. Another one is a genuine worry about whether the state is sort of focusing its energies.
On the train element, Alex, we do have private companies operating freight quite successfully. Is it that you think that the government is involving itself in cargo train, or will there just be setting up the infrastructure for these other companies to do the job?
Both. I think this is why they also emphasize the passenger trains. The government will be running a lot of the passenger trains, but they're expanding the sort of like universal cargo capacity. So what's interesting is people say Mexico's a country without trains. It's actually got about 29,000 kilometers of train lines, mostly vast, the enormous majority is cargo. And they'll only, quote unquote, be expanded by about 11%, so like 3,000 kilometers more. It'll definitely make a difference. I think they're revitalizing the system. I think one of the issues with the privatization of these essential services is that the private sector will only give it enough maintenance in this to the degree that it's profitable, and so it's not even a Mexican debate like in the United Kingdom, where I'm in right now. The big debate is whether it should be renationalized, the entire or large chunks of the rail system, and this isn't a particularly left-wing Labour government, I'd say, and so it's a big global discussion about whether essential services should be privatized or a public option or something in between. I think we'll get something in between with trains.
I mean, it sounds like you have greater faith in this government than the previous government in cajoling, interesting the private sector, or it's less antagonistic. Yet Claudia Sheinbaum seems to be quite ideologue in certain aspects. Why are you optimistic in that sense?
My favorite tease for my friends in Morena is when they ask me, oh, do you support President López Obrador? I'd say, oh, no, I'm left-wing. I've always said that a lot of the policy we saw with López Obrador was politically genius, but I think weirdly, ideologically, sort of all over the place. Claudia Sheinbaum is very much a clear left-winger. I disagree with her on a lot of policy. I think a lot of it is misguided, especially on the political side. But I think she's also a pragmatist. I think she understands, like most proper left-wingers do, that what makes or breaks a left-wing government from the Allende traumas onwards is a deficit, is an economic collapse, and you cannot allow that to happen. So I think you need to have your macroeconomics stable. That's why they respect the Bank of Mexico over even the Supreme Court, I'd say. And you've got to have sort of the private sector behind you, because as we all know, the public sector in Mexico is actually rather small. The vast majority of investment in this country comes from the private sector, and it probably should stay that way.
So, Alex, one of the parts of Plan Mexico is Mexico getting into semiconductors. As you know, Mexico spends very little on R&D. I think it's the lowest in the OECD, about 0.5% of GDP. Chips needs huge amounts of stable electricity, which Mexico doesn't have, and low-cost electricity, which Mexico doesn't have, and it also needs ultra-pure and sort of water. And there are no which Mexico doesn't have, and there are no anchor farms today, in Mexico producing semiconductors. Why do you think, if you do think that semiconductor expansion in Mexico, is going to work and make sense?
I was lucky enough to work on the roadmap that funded by USAID and a bunch of other really interesting specialist organizations. I worked on the roadmap as to why Mexico can and should get involved in the semiconductor industry. And the answer is because it's an enormous industry. It is the future, but it's also layer upon layer of complexity. The United States, for example, would really like Mexico to develop its ATP capacities, which it means assembly, testing, and packaging, but what it really means is just maquila. So you're the maquiladora, the assembly plant of chips made in the United States, because the costs are much, much lower. So you could end up, I'm sure that people would have been skeptical about the degree of how sophisticated Mexico's aerospace industry is, for example, a few years ago, but it got up there. So this is sort of like a low, hanging fruit entry into the world of semiconductors. And yet, I would say that we can go even further. One of the things that's clear to Mexicans is that we don't need to just cater to the Americans. We can also start doing our own semiconductor research and development specifically. You actually need less money for it, and Mexico is prepared for it. One of the sadder stories I've come across is the story of Lagarto, which is El Instituto Politécnico Nacional's project to basically reverse engineer a chip from basic principles, or rather engineer a chip from basic principles. And they've been working on it for 10 years, and it's been very piecemeal. But what was incredible was when Europe started funding its chip manufacturing, because they realized, oh gosh, we've got to start making our own chips. Look at Taiwan, look at the United States, etc. They put the research and development part in Barcelona, where El Poli had connection to the local university. El Poli gave Lagarto, the chip, over to that technology, the blueprints for it, over to the Spanish university. And the Spanish said, oh my God, you've saved us 10 years. And the reason we just handed it over is because there's no investment, because they basically reached the very limit of where you can continue to investigate without needing to create prototypes. Prototypes, by the way, cost about $60,000 each. And so, again, right, you need a lot of investment from the private sector or the public sector. The Spanish had it from the public sector in this case. And they're like, hooray, that's wonderful. So the Spanish came away with 10 years of research and they just stormed off into the distance with their new technology. And the Mexicans got the delight of knowing that technology had worked. And that's it, right? And so I think that's the sad part of the lack of an industrial policy. You lose out on all these pretty interesting opportunities. And again, right, we're not talking about like the microchips made by TSMC in Taiwan. These can be pretty, we'll call them low-level processors, microprocessors, that will open and close a car window, that'll turn a washing machine on and off. They're sort of simple chips that you send off and can be made elsewhere, but you can design them maybe hand in hand with Mabe, with Volkswagen, with the companies that need them in the assembly stage. So Mexico is well positioned for that, but it requires investment.
Thanks, Alex. Very much hope you're right. Last question, if I may. World Cup next year. Will Claudia Sheinbaum drive into Estadio Azteca in a Mexican-made electric car?
I think most likely it'll be a mechanical Turk. It'll be dressed up as a Mexican electric car with like hamster wheels running within. But I'm more optimistic than most people because I've spoken to the people working in Linea. Again, right, they've got so little money. But they're, again, being quite clever about it. They're working behind the scenes with, I won't say any names, but with famous ride-sharing car companies, you can guess who, and other companies that have the money and the interest in making this technology happen. So again, it's only happening because of interest from the private sector, but it's the Mexican public sector which is actually pushing them to actually start investing in Mexico. So again, it's a two-part system. You can't fly this plane without both wings.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you both. It's been lovely.
Well, I think that's it for this week. Thank you, everyone, for joining MexMoves. I hope you listen in next week.
Thank you, everyone. Subscribe, and we'll be here next week as always.